Elias Veyron had never imagined that the invitation he received from the interstellar conclave of harmony would place him at the very center of the galaxy's judgment. Yet here he was, standing on a marble platform of alien design beneath an endless ceiling of glowing crystal lights, surrounded by representatives of species that had lived for thousands of years and looked upon humanity as nothing more than an amusing child stumbling through the stars. The hall was filled with rows of gleaming eyes, some bright with curiosity, others sharp with disdain, and at the center of it all, upon a pedestal carved from obsidian, rested the Xenotone, a legendary instrument said to be older than entire civilizations, an instrument that responded not just to touch but to the inner spirit of whoever dared to play it, an instrument that few alien masters had ever been able to control, and now, against all sense and expectation, a human had been chosen, or perhaps mocked, into attempting to command it. Whispers rolled across the chamber like distant thunder, laughter bubbling from throats of creatures with scales, tendrils, and mechanical masks, each laugh layered with the certainty that the human would embarrass himself, that his kind's primitive grasp of music could never awaken the Xenotone, that this spectacle was nothing more than an amusing diversion before more serious matters of politics and trade resumed, and yet Elias, standing at the edge of the pedestal, did not flinch from the noise, for although his heart beat like a drum inside his chest, his gaze remained steady, drawn not to the faces mocking him but to the instrument itself, a structure of luminous strings and crystalline plates that seemed to hum with a faint vibration even in silence, as if alive, as if aware of his presence. He remembered how the invitation had arrived, not with respect but with derision, a challenge thrown at humanity's feet, a dare sent by alien dignitaries who found entertainment in human boldness. "Let your musician try," the message had said, "and watch as the Xenotone rejects him." Yet Elias had accepted without hesitation, not because he believed he could master the alien artifact, but because he could not endure the thought of walking away from a challenge that touched the very core of his passion. From childhood, music had been his refuge and his power. When wars had shaken his planet and storms had torn apart his home, when he had stood alone in darkened streets without family to comfort him, it had been the soft echo of strings beneath his fingertips that gave him reason to rise each day, and now, facing the galaxy's laughter, he clung to that memory like a shield. The announcer, a towering being with silver skin and eyes like molten gold, raised a clawed hand for silence, though the silence that fell was filled with hidden smirks and stifled chuckles, and with a deep voice that resonated like struck metal, he declared, "Behold, the human representative, Elias Veyron. He will attempt the Xenotone." The pedestal extended toward Elias, and he stepped forward, the sound of his boots echoing through the cavernous hall, each step heavier than the last, as though unseen weights pressed down upon him. He reached the base of the Xenotone, its surface gleaming with faint blue light, and for a moment he hesitated, not from fear of failure but from awe, for the instrument seemed less a creation of hands and more a living thing, its crystalline plates pulsing as though breathing, its strings glowing faintly like veins filled with starlight, and in that instant he wondered if he was truly worthy even to touch it. Behind him, a hiss of laughter rose again, an alien voice mocking, "Careful, human, it bites," and another chimed, "Perhaps he will break it with his clumsy hands," and the hall rippled with cruel amusement, but Elias closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, shutting out their scorn. He remembered his old teacher, a frail woman whose voice trembled but whose hands never wavered when they struck the chords of a violin, telling him once, "Music is not sound, Elias. It is truth. If you carry truth inside you, no instrument will refuse you." Those words guided him now. He lifted his hands, letting them hover just above the Xenotone strings, feeling the faint hum of energy brushing against his skin like static. The air grew tense, the crowd leaning forward, waiting for the failure they believed inevitable. Elias's fingers trembled, not with fear but with the weight of everything that had brought him here. His people's reputation, humanity's pride, his own stubborn refusal to bow to ridicule, and at last he let his fingertips touch the glowing strands. The Xenotone shivered at his contact, a faint vibration rippling through the hall, and for a breathless moment, there was no laughter, no whisper, only silence so deep that even the air seemed frozen. Then the first note rang out, a strange and awkward sound, raw and jagged, as though the instrument resisted his attempt. The aliens burst into laughter, louder now, some clutching their sides, others slamming their hands against the marble in amusement, the sound echoing across the chamber like thunderous mockery. Elias's face flushed, but he did not pull away. Instead, he pressed deeper, coaxing the strings again, letting his touch soften, letting his heart guide rather than his fear, and as he played, the sound shifted, still imperfect but carrying something beneath it, something alive. The laughter did not matter now. His hands moved slowly, searching for the hidden truth of the Xenotone, while unseen eyes of the galaxy judged his every breath. The first trembling note faded into the vast chamber like a fragile spark swallowed by darkness, and the sound of laughter rolled once more from the alien audience, cruel and mocking. For to them it seemed that the human had proven his weakness in a single touch, yet Elias Veyron did not step back, nor did he allow his spirit to bend beneath their scorn. Because deep within him, he felt that the instrument was not rejecting him but testing him, and he refused to surrender. Instead, he let his hands linger on the luminous strings of the Xenotone, his breath steadying as his fingers traced the invisible current that pulsed through it, and then, very slowly, he plucked another note, softer than the first, yet deeper, carrying within it the whisper of something raw and human, a memory perhaps, or an emotion too subtle to name, and for the first time the laughter faltered. A few alien eyes narrowing as though they sensed a shift they could not explain, and Elias, encouraged by the faint stillness, let his mind drift back into the story of his own life, because he realized that the Xenotone did not respond to force or skill alone but to truth, and his truth was written in music. He remembered nights under broken roofs where the wind screamed through shattered windows, and how he had played his old wooden guitar with numb fingers just to remind himself that he was alive. He remembered the funeral of his mother where he had stood alone, too young to understand death yet old enough to feel its silence, and how he had strummed a trembling lullaby to hold back his tears. He remembered the quiet smiles of strangers who paused in war-torn streets to listen to his song and found, if only for a moment, a reason to hope, and as these memories rose within him, his hands moved with them, coaxing notes from the Xenotone that shimmered like distant stars and sank into the silence of the hall. At first the sound was fragile, hesitant, as though the instrument itself was unsure of his heart, but then the tones began to weave together, forming a melody unlike anything the aliens had ever heard, for it was not built on rigid scales or perfect structure, but on the uneven rhythm of a human life, on struggle, on hope, on grief, on the stubborn will to rise again and again even when the universe seemed determined to crush him. The chamber grew quiet, the laughter dying completely as the music spread, not loud but deep, carrying with it an ache that reached into the bones of every listener. A creature of iron and circuits paused its mechanical humming and tilted its head as if confused by the strange stirring within its cold frame, while a scaled being with emerald eyes clenched its claws against the marble as though some unfamiliar weight pressed down upon its chest. And across the hall, dignitaries who had sworn never to show weakness found their throats tightening with emotions they could not name. Elias did not notice them, for he was lost in the song, letting the Xenotone amplify the essence of his heart until even he no longer knew whether the sound came from his hands or from the depths of his soul. The instrument glowed brighter, its crystalline veins pulsing in rhythm with the melody, casting shifting patterns of light across the alien faces, making the chamber itself feel alive, and when Elias struck a lower chord, the entire hall seemed to vibrate with the sorrow of lost worlds, of forgotten loves, of battles that left scars no victory could erase. The aliens who had mocked him now sat frozen, some with eyes wide, others with mouths slightly open, and though none wished to admit it, their hearts had begun to ache in ways they had never experienced, for their species, long hardened by time and power, had forgotten what it was to feel the raw weight of being fragile, mortal, and yet unbroken. The melody rose, carrying with it the echo of laughter not cruel but innocent, the laughter of children chasing one another through sunlit fields, a sound so alien to warlike empires that even the most callous of rulers found themselves leaning forward, longing for something they had never possessed. Then the music shifted, deepening into the heavy toll of despair, the sound of doors closing forever, of voices fading into silence. And even those who had lived centuries felt a sting of sorrow as if they, too, had lost something precious. Suspense gripped the hall, for none knew what would come next, and they feared and longed for it in equal measure. Elias's hands moved with growing confidence, his heart guiding him through peaks and valleys of emotion, and the Xenotone responded, its strings glowing brighter with each passing note until it seemed as though he held the very veins of the universe beneath his fingertips. He struck a sequence that trembled like fragile glass about to shatter, then softened into a warmth that wrapped around the listeners like a long-forgotten embrace, and across the chamber beings who had never wept felt moisture sting their alien eyes, their bodies trembling with emotions they had no words to describe. The conclave of harmony, a place where rival empires gathered to flaunt their power, had been transformed into something else entirely, a sanctuary of silence where every being sat captive to a single human's truth. Yet beneath the awe ran a tension, a suspense that prickled at the edges of the gathering, for none could understand how it was possible. How could a human, mocked and underestimated, awaken the Xenotone in a way their own masters had failed to do for centuries? Was the instrument revealing some hidden truth about humanity, or was it simply choosing Elias for reasons beyond comprehension? These questions hung unspoken, and with each new note the weight of mystery grew heavier, until the aliens were no longer mocking him but fearing him, not for his power but for what his music revealed about themselves. Elias, unaware of the storm he had stirred, let his hands carry him deeper into the song, the Xenotone glowing brighter, the chamber vibrating with every chord, and as the final notes of his melody swelled into the air, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, suspended between awe and dread, waiting for the moment when the music would either collapse into silence or rise into something eternal. The chamber remained frozen in silence as the last trembling notes of Elias's melody hovered in the air, fading slowly like starlight retreating beyond the horizon, and though the music had stopped, its echo lingered inside every listener, not in their ears but in their very core, a resonance that would not leave. And in that fragile stillness the aliens realized with growing unease that what they had heard was not simply a performance but a window into the human spirit. Elias, standing before the glowing Xenotone, could feel it too, as though the instrument itself was no longer just a tool but an extension of his heart, feeding on his memories and reflecting them outward in ways he could not control, and when he closed his eyes again, more images rose unbidden within him. Flashes of ruined cities lit by fire, the sound of hurried footsteps in dark alleys, the heavy silence of soldiers staring at the sky before battle, and beneath it all the stubborn heartbeat of survival that had carried humanity through endless ages of struggle. His fingers moved again, almost without his command, and the Xenotone answered with a sound so deep that the marble floor seemed to tremble, a tone that carried sorrow and resilience together, and the audience shifted uneasily, for though they had expected music, what they now felt was memory itself, a living echo of a species that refused to be forgotten. The melody carried grief, but not despair. It was the grief of those who had buried their dead and still risen to fight another day. The grief of children who cried in hunger yet laughed again when the sun returned. The grief of exiles who carried their home only in stories but spoke them aloud so the past would not vanish, and the aliens, who had long hidden behind centuries of cold reason or ruthless dominance, found themselves shaken by this strange power. For many of them had lived long lives untouched by true loss, and now they felt as if a storm had broken through their guarded minds. A being with wings of glass and eyes like liquid silver clutched its chest, gasping as though the song had torn open a wound it never knew existed. A warlord with jagged armor shifted restlessly in his seat, remembering for the first time the soldiers he had ordered to their deaths, and beside him a diplomat of another empire wiped at her face in confusion as tears spilled unbidden, her kind never having known what it was to cry. The suspense thickened, for the conclave was no longer an audience but a captive people, each one trapped within the reflection of humanity's echo, and yet none could turn away, because the more Elias played, the more they hungered for the sound, unable to understand how pain could be beautiful, how sorrow could carry strength. The Xenotone glowed brighter now, the crystalline veins pulsing like a heart, each note radiating outward as though carried on invisible waves through the very bones of the galaxy, and some whispered in awe that they could feel the music beyond the hall, across ships in orbit, even in cities light-years away, as if the song had pierced the fabric of space itself. Elias did not know this, nor did he care. He was lost in his own memories, remembering his father's calloused hands teaching him the first chords on an old instrument, remembering the sound of voices singing together in shelters while storms raged outside, remembering moments of kindness from strangers who had nothing yet shared everything, and with each memory his fingers struck the Xenotone more firmly, weaving truth into sound. The aliens leaned forward, their mockery gone, their arrogance forgotten, and though many tried to resist, they found themselves trembling with something deeper than fear. It was recognition, for in the echo of humanity they saw pieces of themselves they had long buried, the longing for connection, the ache of mortality, the fragile hope that tomorrow might still bring light. The suspense built further when Elias's melody shifted again, rising now into tones of defiance, carrying the pulse of rebellion and the fire of freedom, and suddenly the chamber filled not with sorrow but with strength. The sound of footsteps marching forward, the roar of voices shouting together, the rising thunder of a people who refused to bow. Leaders of empires shifted uneasily, realizing that what they heard was not just a song but a reminder of what humanity could become, a force not of weapons but of unyielding spirit, and some feared that if this echo spread too far, it might awaken ideas their own subjects had long suppressed. The Xenotone thrummed louder, each note now like a strike of lightning across the silence, each chord a promise that even the smallest voice could rise above the greatest power, and the galaxy's mightiest rulers, who had laughed only moments before, now sat as prisoners to the truth of a single human song. Elias opened his eyes then, and he saw the faces before him, creatures of 1,000 shapes, each one still and silent, their expressions twisted not with ridicule but with awe, fear, and something even deeper, respect. He felt sweat on his brow, his hands trembling not from weakness but from the intensity of the connection, and for the first time since stepping onto the platform he understood what was truly happening. The Xenotone was not only revealing his story, it was binding it into theirs, creating a bridge between human memory and alien hearts, making them feel as if they had lived his life, as if his story belonged to them too. That realization struck him harder than any laughter ever could, because it meant that this moment was bigger than himself, bigger than humanity even. It was a moment that would ripple outward into the galaxy, changing how species saw one another, changing how they saw the fragile race from Earth. The suspense was unbearable now, because no one knew how far the music would go, whether it would rise into triumph or collapse beneath the weight of emotions too heavy to bear, but all waited breathlessly for the next note, the next echo of humanity that had already begun to unravel the walls they had built around themselves. The Xenotone pulsed brighter than ever as Elias's hands continued to dance across its glowing strands, and the sound that filled the chamber no longer seemed like music alone but like a living force that wrapped around every being present, pulling them into its rhythm, binding them together whether they wished it or not. And as the melody deepened it carried with it the weight of something greater than sorrow or triumph, it carried unity, the invisible thread that connected all life despite distance, shape, or history, and though none in the audience had expected it, they felt themselves drawn into that bond, rivals and enemies finding their breaths aligned, their hearts beating in time with the song. The leaders of empires who had sat with cold glares, prepared to sneer at the humans' failure, now found themselves unable to look away, their thoughts unraveling as the music pulled memories from them too, not just Elias. The Xenotone seemed to awaken something buried in each listener, reminding them of their first friendships, of the hands they once held, of the promises they had kept or broken, and even the most ruthless among them felt the fragile echo of connection stirring within. The melody shifted again, rising like a dawn breaking across an endless horizon, and in its sound was no longer just grief or defiance but a call, an invitation to remember that every being, no matter how alien, carried the same longing for belonging, the same fear of loss, the same hope for tomorrow, and slowly the chamber, once filled with divisions of power and pride, became a single vessel for the song. A dignitary from the crystalline people turned to glance at a longtime rival of the scaled empires, and for the first time in centuries they did not see an enemy but another soul, trembling in the same melody. Two warlords who had fought bloody battles against each other shifted in discomfort as their eyes met, both unwilling to admit that the music had carved through the walls they had built, yet both unable to deny that they now felt less like adversaries and more like mirrors of one another. The suspense in the hall grew sharper, for this was no ordinary performance. It was a force they could not stop, a tide that carried them all together whether they wished it or not, and though fear flickered in the eyes of some, none dared interrupt. Elias felt it too, though he did not fully understand. He only knew that his song was no longer his alone, that with each passing moment it belonged more to them, to the galaxy itself, and he played with that truth in his heart, allowing the notes to rise into harmony so vast that even the walls of the chamber seemed to hum in response. The Xenotone's glow spread outward, casting waves of light across the hall, painting every being in colors that shifted with the chords: violet for sorrow, gold for hope, blue for peace, crimson for defiance, and the audience, once individuals, now looked like a single tapestry woven together by sound and light. The galaxy's historians, sitting among the crowd, began to realize with awe and dread that they were witnessing something that would alter history, for the conclave of harmony, once little more than a political stage, was becoming in this moment a sacred ground of transformation, and it was not through treaties or war but through the hands of a human who had been invited only as a joke. The suspense deepened as whispers rose among the most powerful figures, not in mockery but in fear of what this meant. If music could do what armies never could, what did that mean for their future, for their control, for the balance of power they had guarded for millennia? Yet no one dared move because the song bound them too tightly. The longer Elias played, the more impossible it became to resist, and though some part of them longed to look away, to break free, they could not, because beneath the fear lay something they craved even more, the strange, fragile comfort of unity. Elias's fingers struck a high sequence then, sharp and bright, like the ringing of bells across a valley, and the Xenotone's voice soared upward, carrying with it a vision so vivid that many gasped aloud. They saw not Earth but something larger, a dream of countless worlds rising together, of voices once divided now singing as one, of differences not erased but celebrated, woven into a harmony that was stronger than any empire alone. The song showed them what could be, and that vision bound them tighter than chains, for even the most cynical felt a spark of longing for it, though they would never confess it aloud. Suspense hung heavy over the conclave, for the melody seemed to be reaching toward a climax, yet no one knew what shape it would take. Would it collapse under its own weight, or would it rise into something so powerful it could not be contained? Elias, sweat running down his temples, felt the strain of the Xenotone pressing on his chest, demanding more of him than he thought he had to give. Yet he refused to stop, because he could sense that the song was not finished, that it had more to speak through him, and he let it flow, letting his heart pour into every note. The chamber vibrated, the crystal ceiling shimmering as though about to break, and for a heartbeat many feared that the hall itself would not withstand the force of the music. But still no one moved, no one dared interrupt, for they were bound, all of them, not by fear of collapse but by the desperate need to know how the song would end. The Xenotone's final notes of the rising harmony still shimmered in the air when Elias felt the instrument draw him deeper, almost as if it was no longer asking for his music but demanding his very soul, and though exhaustion trembled in his hands, he pressed on, because he sensed that the melody was only halfway through its journey, that what had been played so far was only the opening of a vast story the galaxy itself needed to hear, and as the next chord burst forth, the entire chamber seemed to collapse into silence, the kind of silence that comes not from the absence of sound but from the weight of every heart listening too intently to breathe. The music softened, fragile like a whisper, and suddenly the melody turned inward, carrying sorrow not only from Elias but from somewhere larger, like the collective grief of countless civilizations that had suffered through ages of war, betrayal, and loss, and the sound reached into each listener's chest, pulling out the ache they had long buried, the pain of battles fought, families lost, and dreams broken, until even the proudest and coldest rulers felt their eyes burn with tears they thought themselves incapable of shedding. An empress from the Iron Dominion clutched her chest as the song forced her to remember the child she had sacrificed for power, while a general from the outer marches lowered his head, haunted by the cries of those he had conquered, and even beings of stone and crystal, who had never before been seen weeping, now quivered as the music cracked open the illusions of strength they had worn for so long. The chamber filled with the sound of muffled sobs, and it was not a weakness but a strange kind of release, for the Xenotone carried their grief upward and away, turning their sorrow into something vast and strangely beautiful, and Elias realized with awe that he was not only playing his music anymore, he was translating the galaxy's heartache into song, giving voice to all the things that words had never been able to express. Suspense rippled through the room as the melody shifted again, this time darker, trembling like a storm at sea, and for a moment many feared that the grief would drown them, that the song would break them completely. But then, just as despair reached its peak, Elias let his hands guide the Xenotone toward light, pulling the music upward into a tender refrain that reminded every listener that grief was proof of love, that sorrow existed only because something precious had once been held, and suddenly the tears spilling across the galaxy were no longer hopeless but cleansing, the kind of tears that heal rather than destroy. The chamber glowed with the Xenotone's light, shimmering across the faces of aliens who had once come here only to mock, and now they were bowed by their own emotions, humbled by a truth they had not wanted to see, that they were not so different after all, that beneath their scales, shells, metals, or flames, they all carried the same fragile core that could be touched by music. The suspense grew heavier, for no one could guess where the song would go next, whether it would rise into triumph or fall back into despair, and the uncertainty held them captive, every pair of eyes fixed on the human whose hands still moved though his body shook with the effort, as if he were a vessel barely able to contain the force flowing through him. Elias himself felt close to breaking, the Xenotone's glow searing his fingers, his heart pounding as if it would burst, yet he would not stop, for he sensed that this was bigger than himself, that he was carrying not just a melody but a revelation, and that the galaxy's future might hinge on what he played next. The song rose one more time, fragile but unyielding, and in that moment the entire conclave felt as if the universe itself was weeping with them, stars and planets trembling in the same rhythm, and though none of them spoke, each being understood the truth without words, that the music was not only Elias's gift but a mirror of their shared existence, a reminder that though they had tried for centuries to separate themselves with power and pride, in the end they were all bound by the same longing for connection, the same grief, and the same hope. The last note of the Xenotone hung in the chamber like a star suspended in the dark, trembling with a light so pure that none dared to move, and Elias, his hands falling away from the strings, felt as if the universe itself had been emptied through him, leaving him both hollow and whole at once. Yet the silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been, for every being present sat frozen, caught in the raw truth the music had shown them, and the suspense was unbearable, as though the galaxy itself waited to see what would come of this fragile moment. Then, slowly, one of the most ancient rulers of the conclave, a being of molten stone who had never once bowed to any living creature, lowered his head before the human, and that single gesture broke the stillness, for others began to follow, not out of fear but out of reverence, and the chamber shifted from a hall of pride to a hall of unity. Elias stood trembling, unsure if he had done enough, when he realized with wonder that his music had not simply entertained but changed the course of history, for enemies who had sat on opposite sides of the chamber were now looking at each other with eyes softened by tears, and voices that once shouted threats were quiet with respect, and though no one declared it, the first fragile thread of peace had been woven in that silence, carried by a song no one would ever forget. Yet suspense lingered, for beyond the chamber the galaxy was still fractured, wars still burned, and distrust still lay deep, but the rulers knew they had witnessed something too powerful to ignore, and whispers began to rise of a new covenant, one not sealed by blood or conquest but by the reminder that even across species and stars, they shared the same emotions, and music had proven it. Elias felt the Xenotone's glow fade under his hands, as though the instrument had given all it had and now slept, and he understood that it was not his alone to keep, that it belonged to the galaxy itself, and that others might someday call upon its voice again, but tonight it had chosen him to be the bridge. He looked across the vast chamber and saw not aliens, not rulers, not rivals, but beings made fragile by a song, beings who were no longer strangers, and he knew deep within that while peace would not come easily, this moment would echo through history as the day the galaxy began to change, the day pride gave way to understanding, the day a human song made even the stars seem to weep. And as the great hall erupted at last, not in mockery but in a thunder of respect and awe, Elias realized that though he had been mocked and doubted, his music had carved itself into the heart of the cosmos, leaving behind a legacy that would never fade, a melody carried not by instruments but by memory, and in the deep silence of his own heart he whispered to himself that this was only the beginning, for the song of humanity had finally been heard.